Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video, we're going to start a two-part series on Firestore CRUD operations. Just did a video not that long ago on this, but they went and changed everything about the API, so I'm going to come back and do it with the new syntax. This will be a two-part series, and the way I'm going to split this up is part one will be the CRUD operations. So we'll create a model, we'll create a service with all our CRUD operations, we'll connect our Firebase project to our Flutter project, and basically cover everything about CRUD in this first video. Second video, we'll come back and complete it and make it a full-blown application. I say full-blown, very simple application. It's going to be a journaling app that looks like this. You can write an entry, you can assign a date, you can go back, change your entry, change the date, and also delete it. So if you want that more full experience following it through and getting that user interface, that's what part two will be for. If you don't, and you want to also see this in action, well, we'll have a Github repo at the end of part two. You can pull down the whole app and then play with it, play with the different CRUD operations from there. So that's what we're doing in this two-part series. Let's go ahead and get started.
All right, so we can get started by creating a Flutter package. So I'm gonna type Flutter create, and I'm gonna use the --org flag here, and my org is gonna be com.julo. You can put in whatever you want there, or you can omit that. The reason I'm using the org flag is that when you go to take something to production, you do have to set a real bundle identifier and get away from the one that's automatically populated in the demo app. That's kind of painful to do, particularly on the Android side. And if you've mixed in Firestore, Firebase, then you have an extra step of going and changing it in there as well. So if you intend to use Firestore, you might as well go ahead and set a real package identifier, and that's why I'm going to do that there. And I'm going to name this journal app. And actually, I'm going to do journal _ app because the dash is not valid in Flutter. All right, so while that happens, I'm going to go to my Firebase console. So I'll go to firebase.google.com. If you don't yet have an account, you will need to set one up. We'll go to our console, and I'm going to add a new project. I have created a demo here, journal app. I've deleted that. It's still there. I think it's taking some time to finish itself, but I'm going to try to create another one. And this is where I want to use a hyphen. I do not want to enable Google Analytics at this time. If you'd like to, you can go ahead and do that. There'll be an extra step there. All right, we'll let that do its thing. In the meantime, I can see that the Flutter project has been created. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. And I forgot to CD into the app before I did that, so let's do this. Let's close that. Let's CD into journal app and then do this. So I don't have every project in my practice folder open at once. That's better. Looks like this has finished in the meantime, so I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And I want to just get myself a Cloud Firestore database set up. So over here on the left side, I'm going to click Cloud Firestore. I'm going to have an option to create the database here, and I'm going to do it in test mode. And I do not want to mess around with authentication in this app. I just want to keep it simple. So test mode means that basically anybody can read or write into your database, which is not something you want to go to production with, but it is fine for development, and then it allows you to get started without dealing with authentication. All right, so there's my collection. It has nothing in it. That's fine. Here's my application. It is just the demo app right now. That's fine. We need to connect these two to each other. So with the recent changes to the API for Dart and Flutter for Firebase. Unfortunately, the documents in Firebase are not as up-to-date as they could be yet, but I still think this is the best guide here for connecting the two, connecting Firebase to Flutter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Docs, and I can click either Get Started for Android or Get Started for iOS. It doesn't matter, because what I'm actually looking for on this page is the fly down over on the left that says Add Firebase with a Framework. And so I hit that fly down, and Flutter is the only option. So if I click on that, I'm going to get a series of instructions for connecting iOS. And then if I hit the chip here, it's going to give me a series of instructions for Android. And these are probably the best set of instructions I have found yet for this. So I'm going to start in Android, and the first step that they detail up here is to create a Firebase project, and we have done that right here. The second is to register your app with Firebase. So we have not done that. So if you click on your project overview, it takes you out here to your main page of your project, and you have this option up here for adding a app to the Firebase project. And so I'm going to click Android right here. All right, and so this is where it's going to ask me for a package name. This is what I was talking about with the --org to try to get this to be something that is unique. So for Android, it generated one for you. It's in the Android folder. It's in app. It's in src. It's in main. It's in this Android manifest.xml. And it is right up here at the top, package com.julo.journal.app. So that's where we can get it. If you wanted to change it, there is more involved than just changing it here, unfortunately. But this is the readable version of what your package name is right there. So we can paste that in. We can skip the optional nickname. We can skip the optional debug certificate because that is for Google sign-in and some other options and things we're not going to use. So we can click Register App. That gives us the option to download Google Services JSON, which we want to do. All right, and then from there, you can skip the rest. Just next, next, until you're out and back to the console, and you can see your Android app is here. We need to find that Google Services JSON that we just downloaded, and we need to drag it into Android app. So right inside that app folder, drag it there. It should not be named with this one. I always have a few of these kicking around. I'm going to delete them while I'm thinking about it. So if you ended up with a one or a number affixed there, let's just take that off. It should be google-services.json like that. All right, so with that, going back to our instructions, we have now registered our app with Firebase. That is step 2. Step 3 is to add our configuration file. We just did that by dropping it into that app folder. Then we need to check our build.gradle files for some values. And so we want to start with the application level one, which is the furthest one out. So this one right here, build.gradle. And we're checking for a few things. So first of all, we're checking that Google exists in the repositories, and it does. We're checking that this Google Services exists in dependencies, which it does not, so I'm going to grab that, copy it, I'm going to paste it right after this Kotlin class path here. And then lastly, we're checking that Google exists in repositories, and it already does. So we're all set there. Next, we want to go into this inner build.gradle, the app or the module level. And we are simply looking to apply this plugin here. So I'll copy that. and we'll just put it right after the Gradle plugin. Actually, I think I will just keep it organized. I'll put it right there because this is where the plugin section ends. Don't think that matters. That's all for the instructions, but I can tell you from experience that once you mix in a few Firebase plugins, most of those will not work prior to SDK 21. So do yourself a favor and bump up SDK, the minimum SDK version to 21 at this point. All right, and the last step is to add our plugins. That's the last step for iOS as well. So I'm going to jump ship over here to iOS at this point. And we need to create our Firebase project. Done. We need to register our app, which we have not done with iOS. So we can add an app at this point. Click on iOS, and we're looking for the bundle ID, which may be different from the Android app identifier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open Xcode. And I'm going to open that project. Now, if you're not on a Mac, unfortunately, you're just not going to be able to set up the iOS application. You'll just need to do Android. But if you are on a Mac and you have Android or Xcode installed, you can go to development, you can go to source. You can go to your project. I'm bringing you through my my app. Go to your project, wherever it is, whatever it's called, and look for iOS. And we're looking for runner.xcode or Xcode proj. All right, and if you click on Runner and we go to the General tab, you will see at the very top a bundle identifier, and you can see that is slightly different from Android. That's fine. Android and iOS don't have to match, but whatever's in here needs to match what's in Firebase, or there will be no connection there. And these are optional, so you can skip these and register the app. Those are easy enough to come back and do again if you want to. That gives you an option to download Google Services Info plist. Do that. And let's come here to Xcode and take that download and put it right in the runner folder like that. You'll get a pop-up. Leave those options as are and click Finish. If you try to do that in Visual Studio Code, something just doesn't quite click a lot of times, so do that in Xcode. And once you've done that in Xcode, you are done with that IDE and you can close it. All right, you can click through next because none of this is anything we're going to have to do here. You can continue to the console, see that you've got your iOS app, head back to our instructions, and we've completed step 2. We've actually completed step 3 by moving that info plist in there, and now we just need to do the plugins, and that applies for both iOS and Android. So let's go to pub.dev, and we need one package to connect it to Firebase, and that is Firebase core. So we're going to go to installing, and I am dealing with version 0.5 and up. The directions for 0.5 are below 0.5, before 0.5 are different. I have a different Firebase CRUD video on how to do that with the syntax from before Firebase core 0.5, and you can refer to that. All right, so I'm going to go to pubspec.yaml. I'm going to come down here to below Cupertino icons. I'm going to paste that in. I accidentally got a space in there. I took it out. Make sure that lines up exactly on the left side with Firebase core because YAML's real touchy like that. All right, so that's the one we need, but we can't really do much with just core. So we want to also get Cloud Firestore so we can do our CRUD operations. So we'll go to installing. Make sure you got .14 or above if you are trying to match to the Firebase Core 0.5 and above. All right, and if you're coming from previous versions of Firebase Core, this was enough to connect the two, but there is now one more step that you need to do. You need to initialize the Firebase project in your Flutter app, and that's something that you end up doing in most APIs, but Flutter used to handle that for you, and it no longer does with this new upgrade, so that needs to happen. So we need to go a little bit into our presentation logic here, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to just take out in lib main.dart. Just want to take all that out entirely. And in the lib folder, I'm going to put a new folder called src, and I'm going to put the app in there. So a new file, and I'm going to call it app.dart. And what I'm just going to have the main.dart do is just run the main Dart function and then call the app class from there. So in app, I'm going to create a stateless widget. So I'm just going to use the STL shortcut and I'm going to call it app. And we'll just make sure we import material. And so instead of a container as they give you in the boilerplate, I'm going to create a material app here. And for a home screen, I'm just going to do scaffold body with a center widget and a child with a text widget that says homepage. So just something on the screen there. I'll just go ahead and give it a theme, not necessary to the back end portion of this, I know, but let's just do an accent color of colors.pink accent. Primary color, we'll do colors.black, and that's good for now. There we go. Let me format that. All right. And then so in our main.dart, instead of my app, we can do app. And I'm just going to change in test. There's a call to my app. So I'm just going to change that to app and import it. That's not a showstopper, but at least get rid of the red there. All right, and the reason I want to do that is I always find this when I build a production app to separate out the app is a good thing. And I think with the new setup for Firebase, it makes even more sense because you end up needing to wrap this or to put some logic before you run the app. And I think it makes more sense and it's cleaner if you have extracted the app into its own class. All right, so here's the last thing you have to do to get Firebase initialized is you do widgets. Flutter binding. There's actually a few ways to do this. I find this one to be the easiest way. We ensure that they're initialized, and then we await Firebase dot ensure initialized. All right, and so that means because we're awaiting, that means that our main function now needs to be asynchronous. So we'll tag that with the keyword. We'll import Firebase Core, Whoops. I copied from above there. Not ensure initialize. This needs to be initialize app, like that. All right, and with all that in place, I'm just going to fire this up. All right, and there it goes. I've got no errors in the console. Everything seems to be running just fine. So for the backend portion of this, I would like to put it all in a service to keep it all nice and clean. So in my SRC folder, I'm going to do a new folder called services. And inside of services, I'm going to put a Firestore underscore service dot dart. And that's a class of Firestore service. And so this is where every interaction with my database will take place. When I build this app, I'm going to build a provider layer that is going to directly talk to the service. And then the provider layer will also talk to the view. So the view is never reaching into the service. All right, so up at the top of our service, this is a little bit different as well. So I think you're used to putting Firebase up here. So instead of Firebase, we want to bring in a Firebase Firestore instance, which I will need to import. I'm going to call it underscore DB, and that is Firebase Firestore dot instance. Like that. So that gets us an instance of Cloud Firestore. I think it used to just be Firebase instead of Firebase Firestore, so slight change there. We're going to have a series of journal entries that we're going to want to get. We are going to want to insert, update, and delete. We'll call that create, just so we have our CRUD right there. All right, and I would like my service to have this all modeled out for me, so when I go and get something from the service, I'm getting back a list of my journal entries. I'm passing in a journal entry to be created or updated. And so I need to define what that entity is, and I'm going to do that through a model. So in my folder, SRC folder, I'm going to create a folder called models, and I'm going to create a new file in that called entry.dart, and this will be where I define my model. So we're going to create an entry class. That's our journal entry. We're going to have variables, so I'll have a final string, which is my entry ID. I'm going to have a final string, which is my date. I'm going to store dates in Firestore as ISO strings. I can then parse those right into datetime in Dart, and I can just call to ISO string from Dart to get it back into a string. So I find that works best when working with strings in Firestore, or working with dates in Firestore. Store them as a string and then work with them as dates on the Dart side. And then lastly, we'll have our entry, which is our actual journal entry. I'm going to build a name constructor for that. So I'll do this dot date, this dot entry, this dot entry ID. And anytime you work with Firestore, so you want to be able to not only define your object, but when you have that object and you want to send it on to Firestore, you're going to need to convert it into a JSON object, and when you get it out of Firestore, you're going to need to convert it from a JSON object into your Dart object for work in your application. And so you need two functions that do that for you in your model. And let's take the first one, which is where we're getting JSON from Firestore and turning it into our object. So we're going to build a factory constructor. So we use the factory keyword. We can define what our extension is going to be called, and I'm going to call it from JSON. And I know what I'm going to be getting as far as Dart is concerned is a map with string keys. Technically, they're all string values, but I prefer to use dynamic here just to keep it flexible. And that shouldn't be JSON, it should be JSON. All right, and when I get my JSON, I want to just pull each one of that out and map it to a property in my object. So I'm going to return an entry. And so the date I'm going to get from JSON date. Entry I'm going to get from JSON entry. And entry ID I'm going to get from JSON entry ID. Now these are just simply the names of the fields in Cloud Firestore, which don't yet exist, but what I intend to do is to create them with the exact same names of my properties. So if I was working with a database that already had, entry underscore my, I would do that, and I wanted it to match entry here, I could map it like that, but I'm going to plan on the fields in my database exactly matching what I've set up here in my property. All right, so that's one way. The other way we need is to take the object and turn it into something we can send on to Cloud Firestore. So that's going to result in a map with string keys, dynamic values, and we'll call it toMap. And we will have it return a JSON object going the other way. So this will be what we end up with for a column name in Cloud Firestore, or a key value in Cloud Firestore. And this is the value that we will populate to it, the date from up here. Entry ID, entry ID. And that is our model. Define our fields, create a constructor, and have two methods that take it from into and out of a Dart object from JSON. All right, so now that we've got our entity defined, I can come back here to Firestore and I can say, all right, if I'm going to get a list of all the entries, I'm going to be getting a stream from Firestore. I could get a future back if I want to, so Firestore offers the option of selecting a stream or a future. With the app, I've got a stream of my journal entries. I think makes the most sense on the front page. And so I'm going to get a list of my entry objects and make sure I double close that bracket there. We'll call it get entries. All right. And so we're going to return from DB. I'm just going to put every operation on its own line. I'm going to get from a collection. I'm going to call my collection entries. And this is where I have the option. I could say get, which would return me a future, or I can do snapshots and get a stream, and I want to get a stream. And so this is going to get me a streaming query snapshot. So I actually want to map that. And I'm going to call it a snapshot. So now I've got a query snapshot on those are docs. And so I actually want to map each one of those docs as well. And now I have that query document snapshot, which has a data property with all the data in it, which I can pass. So I'm going to do entry, going to call from JSON doc data like that. So this contains all the JSON right here, this data. We pass this to our model from JSON property, and it's able to take that JSON because we defined that and turn it into our Dart entry. And then we don't quite have a list, so go inside of the last parenthesis and cast it to a list, and then you're ready to follow that up with a colon, and that will allow you to get a list or collection from Firestore, cast it into a list of your custom object. Not technically part of CRUD, but still good to know. If you wanted to query in here, you could do that. So this is where you could jump in with where date, we could say is greater than datetime.now. And we could say, all right, we're going to add a duration of days minus 30, and we'll cast that to an ISO string like that. So this would say, okay, only give me entries in the last 30 days. Oops, I don't want a semicolon there. And anything older than 30 days you wouldn't get out of that collection. So you could do that there if you wanted to. All right, so for our create and our update, so what I like to do is to just combine the two into an upsert. All right. This is my preferred method of operation here, and this will say, all right, if the record doesn't exist, go ahead and create it. If it does exist, update the fields that I'm providing, and if I'm not providing certain fields, leave those alone. All right, so there is a specific update function in Firestore, but I'm thinking that the set data with the options, which is what I'm going to use, I'm banking that that's going to be what they hold on to, just because with the options you can do so much more, whereas the update just kind of does one thing. Maybe they'll keep the update in the mix, but I'm kind of banking on the set options being the future here. All right, and so regardless, I'm going to get back a future void. And I'm going to call this set entry because I don't want to give the impression that it's an insert or an update. And so what we can do is we can pass in our object. Now this object, we could, because we've made our fields non-required, we could omit the date and just pass in the journal entry. We could omit the ID. Actually, we're going to need the ID for purposes of identifying the record. Let me show you here. So what we're going to do is we're going to return DB collection, and we're going to go into our entries collection, not that. All right, so, and then we're going to go and look at a specific doc reference. This used to be document, so doc is the new syntax. And what we're going to do is we're going to look in the entry ID, so that if the unique identifier already exists, we're going to get that record, and then we're going to set entry, and we have an entry object. We have our toMap function, which we created, which will take it from the Dart object, turn it into JSON, because that's what Firestore wants to see. And should not have a semicolon there. All right, so this, as written, is a create function only. This will overwrite anything that we pass in. So if we pass this without the date for an update, it would simply drop the date. And that's not what we want. So up here at the top, we can create an options variable, and that is going to be a set options class. And in here, we can merge and set that to true. And then we can pass in those options here. So what this is going to do is, if we are creating a new entry, it's going to take the entry ID that we give it, and we're going to write in our provider a function that will get a unique ID for it and pass it in. It's going to pass that in. We will create a new record at that entry ID. When we go to update, it's going to find that record, and it is going to take the fields that it has in this entry, and it's going to update those fields. If we omit, say, the date, and we just update the entry, the writing from the journal for that day, because we've set merge to true, when we go to update, we're just going to update the entry field, and the date that is there will stay. If we set this to false, or we had just left it without any options, the new object, or the object we pass in, would overwrite what was there, and so the date would disappear because it's not on our update. But by setting merge to true, we are creating the ability to add a new record or to update a record, and to not take out any fields that we choose to omit. If you want different behavior, you can set it accordingly through your merge options, but that's the behavior that I want. That's an upsert behavior. All right, then so lastly we need to delete, and this one's pretty simple. We want a future void. I'm going to call it remove entry, and I'm just going to pass in the entry ID, and we'll return DB collection, and the doc will be the entry ID. So we'll make sure we have an entry ID field that matches our document reference, and then we will simply delete. All right, and because we are actually needing our entry ID to identify our object here, like I said, we could omit fields here and just simply have them not updated. But if we omitted an entry ID, we'd really be in trouble because we couldn't identify. So what I'm going to do here is just come inside my constructor and say, when you construct an entry, this is required, and that requires an import from material. Like that, and that way whenever we create an entry object, we can omit date, we can omit entry if we're just updating those, but we can never omit the entry ID, which we need to identify that in the record. All right, so that is essentially the CRUD part of the application in the new syntax for the Dart API for Cloud Firestore and for Firebase. And so if you're only here for that, I want to let you go at this point. We'll wrap up this episode. And the second episode, what I will do is build a provider, which will act as the intermediary between our screens here and our Firestore service. And we will put these into play. You can start to see them in action. We'll populate our database and go from there. And then we'll come back and play with these options a little bit so that you can visually see how options like merge equal true, false, how these queries in here interact with the screen. So that will be part 2 of this series, should you care to join us. But thanks for watching this one. Hope you found it helpful.